into part 4 of this 4-part episode podcast about Violet's journey. Part 1 was preconception. Part 2 was my pregnancy. Part 3 was my birth story. And then whilst I was recording part 3, I realized there is a part 4. Just like the trimesters, there are 4 of them, the 4th being the postpartum journey. Now, whenever I record my podcasts, I just do them off the cuff and I don't actually listen back to them, but I think I missed some key parts. So I want to fill in the gaps and I want to share with you how I navigated my postpartum journey. I have decided to record these podcasts simply to share with you, simply to inspire those of you who might be looking for more information. Please note, I should have said this on all of the podcasts, that this is not advice and you do need to work within yourself and with your team who are supporting you to be able to make these decisions. However, I like to be transparent. So this is what this is all about. You can also watch my podcast, the visual versions, on my YouTube channel. I haven't shared that with many of you, but some of you prefer to listen, but there are also video versions as well. Okay, so some gaps that I wanted to fill in was that during my pregnancy journey, I decided not to have any scans, being ultrasounds, and I decided not to have any tests. That was anything and everything. So no blood tests, no checks, no scans. And my dad is a sonographer, someone who does ultrasounds on babies. And my mum used to be a midwife, but was in her later days a theatre nurse. Now, I cannot remember if I added this in here, so I just wanted to slot it in, that I was 29 at the time when I was pregnant. And when I told my parents this at first, they were like, why would you do this? You don't know if anything's wrong with the baby and so on. And then as I gave time for things to settle, they came around and said, actually, my dad said, you're low risk. You should be fine. You're healthy. And I was, apart from some of my pain story stuff that I've shared with you with my skin issues and everything that I had to work on to heal before I decided to get pregnant. And then I guess my mum just kind of went along with it as well. My mum is actually an older mum. She had me when I think she was either 44 or 45. So she had my sister and I in her 40s. I do work with some older women who are told and have this whole biological clock thing behind them. There is some truth behind that, but I do believe, you know, if you desire to get pregnant, there is a lot of deeper emotional work that you can do. And I always love to throw in there when they feel like, you know, can I get pregnant? That my mum had us in our 40s and I think we turned out okay. So I've got some notes to make sure I don't miss anything because this is the last part of this podcast. So basically no scans, no tests, didn't do the glucose testing. But of course, what I was willing to do was if I didn't feel well in myself, is I wasn't going to be staunch in that. I would get tests done. I saw my midwife a very minimal amount of times during the pregnancy. I'd say it was probably about 3 or 4 times because I was traveling quite a bit between New Zealand and interstate, so outside of Melbourne. And I also built a relationship with her. So if she felt if anything was wrong, we would discuss it, and then I would make my decision from there. So just the open discussions was really important. So I think I finished off and I was starting to lead into some things that were happening post-birth. And what am I going to cover on this? So I'm just looking at these notes because I keep on disappearing. I'll talk about the lotus birth and when the umbilical cord drops off. Vaccinations, this is a controversial topic, but I like to be transparent, so I'll talk about my decisions around that. Stuff around not having contact with people in the early days. I did have a little bit of a perineal tear and how that played on my mind. Co-sleeping, postpartum bleeding and herbs, mastitis, I'll share about that as well. So there are some things in here where you can recognize that there are things that you can do for stuff that is undesirable. Breastfeeding, baby wearing, finding a pram in hard rubbish, cloth napping, elimination communication, and choosing not to see the maternal health nurse or what they know as plunket here in New Zealand. Okay, so let me try and remember these, and I might have to flick back to my phone to cover those notes. So I had a lotus birth. I talk about that in the last couple of episodes. And everyone wants to know, when is the umbilical cord and the placenta going to detach? So it's when the placenta is kept attached to the baby, you don't cut the umbilical cord. And I think that this is just absolutely fascinating to have a look at your placenta before it might get thrown in the bin in biohazard. I think it's really beautiful here in New Zealand that a lot of people will keep the placenta and bury it under a tree. Now, I still have a placenta, Violet's placenta, dehydrated and blended up in a container, in a courier container, in the top of my cupboard. We haven't done what we intended to just yet. So that was actually another piece I wanted to talk about. But what's really fascinating is when you watch the umbilical cord over the days, is that it's white, it's floppy, and then you see the 3 vessels that have fed and taken waste away from your baby. During this time, you see them very clearly, and then it dries to beef jerky. And so I covered a little bit about this in the previous episode, so I won't go into it in depth. There's a whole just nurturing the lotus, the placenta, wrapping it, taking care of it so it doesn't smell. But Violet's one took 5 days to drop off. And it was actually our midwife was the first person to hold her without her placenta, because it just happened to be timed with her appointment. And there was a little cry when the umbilical cord released. And I think I said I had FOMO. So I had heard about placental encapsulation, but I did decide to cut away a teaspoon amount. Gab did that. And then I had it in smoothies over the next 7 days, because for me, it was more important to keep that placenta attached. But I've had friends where it's dropped off after 3 days, other times where it's dropped off after 10 days. Now, one of the big things is that we really wanted to bond with Violet. We didn't want to have other people's smells. We didn't want her passed around. We didn't want to be distracted. We wanted to be very present with her. So during this time, I wrote a letter to my parents well before I was due to have the baby about our request, because I was at my parents' house in Melbourne. They agreed for me to have a home birth there. So I was very grateful about that. But I'm in their house, and now I don't want them to see their first granddaughter while we're in their house. Now, I'm very grateful for them taking on board the letter that I wrote, which explained our reasoning. And they didn't see Violet for 48 hours. And we didn't tell Gab's parents. We didn't want to be preoccupied on the phone to have to deliver the news to anyone. So it was agreed and it was planned that my parents would call his parents and tell them that the birth went fine and there is a baby and whatever her name is. So I actually stayed in the bedroom, and Gav brought me all of my food. Bought and brought. He's always on to me about my grammar. He brought me in all of my meals. He looked after the nappies. We cloth nappied from day one. And yeah, it was just really incredibly supportive during that period of time. So he got to interact with my parents, but really he would be with me most of that time. We also decided that we weren't going to be on our phones during this time. I wasn't big on social media anyway. And my friends, my 3 good friends in Melbourne, also knew that we wouldn't be getting in touch for at least a couple of weeks. So we'll get in touch when we're ready. And if we changed our mind, we could always change our mind. So 48 hours I just had with Violet. I didn't have a shower after the birth. I did have a water birth though, in the spa, in the bathroom. And we also didn't wrap our baby in clean towels. We were more about skin to skin contact, but of course, sometimes you do have to wrap them up a little bit. And so it was, right, we're going to use our towels that we've been cleaning ourselves with, but they're not going to be clean. They're just going to be the towels that we've cleaned ourselves with, and it's got our bacteria. So she can be swaddled and wrapped in that. Now, it was also really hot, and I shared a previous story about her overheating her first night because I didn't listen to my intuition, and I listened to my midwife telling me she's going to have 1 layer extra than us. But it was October in Melbourne, and it does get quite hot, but she's a very pitta-natured child, so she does overheat very easily. So she lived most of her life in cloth nappies and sarongs. And we actually bought a lot of her clothes from secondhand markets. There's so many of them in Melbourne. And I'm so glad we did that. And I reckon we only spent maybe $100 to $200 before our baby arrived. We didn't go get the pram. We didn't buy stuff beforehand, because if anyone's had kids, they realize that they probably buy a lot of stuff that they don't use and they end up giving away. So we were really minimalistic at that time and just bought secondhand clothes. And thank goodness, because probably 3/4 of them didn't even get worn. So I often will tell my clients, like, don't worry, don't prepare for, like, you don't really need to prepare for it. I'm mindful of who I tell this to, but just go and buy the stuff as you need it. We didn't have baby showers. We weren't given a whole heap of stuff. And thank goodness we weren't given all that stuff, thankfully. Anyway, so even a pram we didn't buy. We actually picked up a pram on one of our walks once we had our baby, and it was in hard rubbish. And I'm so glad that we didn't spend thousands of dollars on a pram and we picked up one in hard rubbish, because Violet would not stay in it. And also I really wanted to baby wear. I was very much attachment parent, just be with her 24/7. And Gav was with her a lot of the time as well. So it wasn't until 10 days that my friends came to visit. And I think 2 of them came over at once, and then the third one lived a little bit further away, so she came over separately. It was really beautiful. It was like the first baby out of our friends, my high school friends, and they are just super lovely. But in the first 10 days, we were just at Violet's beck and call. Now, I would have to say she was one of the only baby that I know of that is just super easy. I don't have any complaints about the postpartum period, really. I decided that I wasn't going to work for a whole year. I decided that I was going to be very present. I felt like if I could breastfeed, and that was my intention, that I would do that for 2 years. I didn't quite make it to 2 years out of choice, but was just going to be there for her. So if she cried, if she was hungry, she could feed whenever she wanted, not schedule feeding. I know there are some people who are very for this, some people it works for them, but I believe that humans are demand feeders. So you feed them when they want. And they're going through so many growth spurts that it's constantly going to be changing. So she was on the boob, drinking breast milk whenever she pleased. She would have her nappies changed every single time she would wet herself or go to the toilet. I'm going to talk about elimination communication a little bit later, which I think we started within even that first week, possibly, but it requires you to be very present. For me, I didn't want my baby sitting in wet nappies, soiled nappies. It wasn't about finding the cloth nappy that would soak up as much as possible. I would happily change 20 nappies in the day, and Gav would as well, if it meant that she got to learn what clean and dry felt like. And it's so interesting when I talk about elimination communication. So yeah, we cloth nappied from day one. I know a lot of people say, oh, they hear that nappies need changing like 8 times a day, and that's a little bit inconvenient. And if that's what it feels like to you, then go for it. But I want to share with you that we managed the cloth napping quite okay. We were doing daily loads of washing, but it was quite okay for us to, and we wanted to change her nappies whenever we knew that she was wet. So in these first 10 days, I would say that Violet barely made a peep or a sound unless she overheated. So we learned that pretty quick. Her first night, she was screaming her head off because she was sweating and she was so hot. But other than that, she was great. She'd just eat, she'd sleep, she'd maybe let out a little whimper, which was, okay, I'll feed you. Yep, basic needs, you're getting cuddles, you're getting love, you're getting fed, you're having your nappy changed. So she barely made a sound, and we were just so attentive, and our focus was on her. And Gav's intention was also not to work for quite a number of weeks or months. It turned into 6 months, which was not ideal. It turned into quite a long time before he actually went off and worked. So we had all that time together. When my friends came over, I realized how all of a sudden my attention went from my baby to them. And it was the first time she started crying and then feeling flustered because my attention was not on her anymore. She could probably feel that. And when she started crying, it's like, okay, we'll go now. And then when are we going to catch up next? When are we going to do this? I'll text you. I'll call you. Okay, my baby's crying. Just go. It's fine. We'll sort it out. But all of a sudden, my needs were on my guests, my friends, who are very self-sufficient, but just that recognition and that awareness in that time of my baby's crying right now, because all of a sudden my attention has gone full time from her to something else. And, you know, I'm quite happy to breastfeed in front of my friends, but I think it was just like, all right, you're going out the door, but 10 minutes later, you're still going out the door. All good. It was just interesting is what I want to say. And yeah, the presence and the energy that I think my baby could feel as well. So I think we laid low for a little bit after that. Wasn't big into showing off our baby or wanting to socialize a whole bunch. It was just, you know, I think the babies are just so cute to watch sleeping. Anyway, so I was very engrossed in her. Now, if I go back to, I feel like I'm jumping around a little bit because there's a lot of things that I want to cover, and I didn't actually take notes for anything else except for this one. We did eventually start venturing out a little bit more. We baby wore with those beautiful Didymos wraps. That can become an obsession, just like buying all sorts of designs of cloth nappies. And yeah, just had her on us as much as possible. I think when she was just so tiny that when Gav would baby wear her a lot, which I was quite happy for him to do, a lot of people wouldn't realize what this stripy thing contraption was on him. And then he'd kind of like pull it away and there's this little baby's head that would come out. And they're like, oh my gosh, there's a baby in there. We were at a market once and he was playing the drums with her on him. And then he like pulled it away to check on her, and everyone was quite surprised that there was a little baby in there. So they're just, gosh, so tiny when they come out. Well, she was anyway. She was 3.6 kilos when she came out. So yeah, we did start venturing out. We did start going out for breakfast and like letting people hold her and all that kind of stuff, but very mindful of who we would let hold her. And they were only too happy to give her back if she like let out a little cry. So I felt like as well, those early days, it was just so easy to be mobile with her because all she needed was the boob and maybe a couple of nappies to change. So we didn't go around with a lot of gear a lot of the time. So I want to come back to the placenta, and I realized that I had this memory the other day, didn't take notes down, and then it was lost, but it's just come back to me. So I love getting inspiration and ideas from other people, but I will always come up with what feels good for me, which might be something that someone else has done, a community has done, or it might be, oh, I like that idea. How can I tweak it to feel good for me? So as I said, in New Zealand, a lot of people from multiculture, they will keep the placenta and plant it under a tree. And I love how a lot of the Western society have taken this on. And I thought, great. But we are so transient. We hadn't actually landed and found a base for ourselves at that time. So I didn't want to plant the placenta under a tree at my parents' house because one day that house is going to get sold. Maybe it'll get developed and I want to be able to, I'd be thinking, well, what do I do? Like I've had friends who pull up the trees that their placentas were planted under and take them with them. We know that that wasn't possible and that we really wanted to be back in New Zealand. So it's like, I like that idea, but it doesn't really work for me. But I do want to keep her placenta. And so we were living in a 1-bedroom apartment at this time and approaching having to move back to choosing to move back to New Zealand. And I had to call customs. Can I bring a placenta back into the country? I remember calling Air New Zealand and then just getting passed on to people and finding out, yep, it's fine. It just needs to be wrapped in this way. So what was the way? I can't quite remember, but it was like it had to be in a double container and quite secure and sealed. So then I had to blend it up because I couldn't really fit it in a container. And I blended it because I knew that we didn't want to bury it whole. So first I had to dehydrate it more than it was already dehydrated. I think we kept it in the freezer after we had salted it and it had dropped off. Then we put it in the oven in this 1-bedroom apartment and dehydrated it. And it was the most disgusting smell. It's human flesh. Hopefully none of you know what this smells like unless you've done this, but dehydrated the placenta. It was disgusting, the smell. And then chucked it in a blender and pulverized it into a placenta dust. And then I put it into a Ziploc bag, and then I put it into a container, and then that container was within another container to meet the customs requirements. So if you're wondering if you can transport it, just call your flight, your airline, and you'll get onto the right person. And then I just had to declare it when I was coming through. But I was really concerned that they were going to take it off me. But I had this documentation. Well, I had proof that I had spoken to people, and I was really determined to get this placenta back into New Zealand. So 8 years later, it's still sitting at the top of my wardrobe. It's come around with us. I haven't looked at it. It's still in the same container it arrived in. And our intention is, because Gav and I are more connected to the mountains, is that perhaps one day we'll take Violet up into these mountains with us and sprinkle her placenta dust wherever, and she probably won't care. But anyway, there's a story behind it. So that is the story of what we decided to do with our placenta. You know, could have done placental encapsulation and eaten it, could have buried it under a tree and then left it in Australia, could have buried it under a tree here in New Zealand. But then we did what was actually connected more to us and what had more meaning to us, which is when it happens, is to sprinkle it over the mountain somewhere. Okay, so that's her placenta. Let me just jump back into my notes. Okay, so vaccinations, I'll share about that. I have not vaccinated Violet. I don't often share this publicly. She hasn't had anything. I don't know how she will tolerate a needle. But yeah, she hasn't had anything. I did think this through quite a bit. I have been vaccinated as a child. And it was interesting because we did have measles go through mainly Queenstown, which is an hour away, but it is where I had a clinic at one point. We did have measles go through New Zealand, and Queenstown was a bit of a hotspot. And it came to Wanaka, but it didn't really plant itself here in Wanaka. So I do want to share about that. There are some things that babies can have immediately after the birth, and I'm not going to go into it in detail, but things like a heel prick, we didn't even want her to have that. The vitamin K, and there was a bunch. And again, our midwife was supportive. This is where I feel like emotional work is really good, and knowing yourself so that you can really advocate, because people will sometimes question, why didn't you do it? It was just a choice for me, and it was thought through. For the vitamin K, if I had had, say, a traumatic birth and there was like forceps, 1-2s, then I would have considered it. That is not an exhaustive list as to why you don't get it. And there are risks, of course, of things going wrong if you don't have these things as well. So this is why you've got to be informed. So I had all these discussions with my midwife. We had done a little bit of research. I had talked to some friends who I really appreciate their knowledge, and I feel they're quite reputable. And then I made my decision from there. So we chose not to do any testing, and we chose not to do any blood tests, vaccinations. And to this day, she still is not. I thought that maybe I would wait till she was 2, and then she got to the age of 2, and I was like, maybe I'll wait till she's 5. And then she kind of got to the age of 5, and I was like, you're all good. You didn't get measles. I will leave you to it. And she has had a great immune system. She hasn't been a sickly child. Yes, she does get the odd thing, but she clears it pretty quickly. And I do give her herbs, sometimes a little bit too late. She does get sick, but she doesn't get sick all of the time. What that has to do with, it could be a variety of things. I mean, for me, I used to get sick all the time because of stress and not speaking my truth. Now I barely get sick. Gav and Violet, just the last few days, have been nailed to the couch sick, and I'm hoping I don't get it. So yeah, when measles came through, I don't know if I'm allowed to speak about this, but I hope I can. When measles came through, I was like, oh shit, should I get her vaccinated? And I'm sure some people had this go through their mind. And you know, in the meantime, I was actually still practicing as an osteopath, and I'd hear people's opinions of why people should do it. They didn't necessarily know what my stance was. I don't enforce it, as in I feel like everyone should follow what I'm doing. I feel like people should follow what actually feels good for them and their own reasoning behind it. So, yeah, but I did question whether or not I should. And I did go to a doctor who I really trust to discuss this. And actually, by the time it was in town, it was kind of too late to do the vaccination. You sort of had to do it earlier. But just to share, it was a moment of like, ooh, have I done the right thing? Should I? I called my friends again that I find quite reputable, and they do a lot more research than me. And then I came to my own informed decision, not a decision out of fear. And she didn't get it, thankfully. I do feel like she is a very robust, very healthy child. So if she was to get it, that she would be okay. But again, I know that is just, I don't know. Like, there are all sorts of things that can happen. So I'm speaking from a position of where she was fine, she was okay, and she didn't get it. And look, if she decides to get things vaccinated when she's older, hopefully I can inform her, and that's up to her if she wants to do that or not. Okay. What else was there? Oh, maternal health nurse is probably a good thing to talk about, because they will usually be weighing your baby, asking about its feeding, its sleep, and also talking about vaccinations. So we knew that we were going to be contacted, like we registered the birth. We were going to be contacted as to whether or not we wanted maternal health nurse services. And we knew that they were going to persist, and we knew that we didn't want to go. Now, I have this thing, again, some of you are really going to value this. I just know myself, and everything was fine with Violet. A lot of people say, you know, you just don't know how you're going to be when you become a mother. And there is part of me that's like, okay, yeah, that's for some people. But also, gosh, it sounds a little bit arrogant, but I'm just going to share this because I often keep quiet when that's said, is that I feel like I could trust my intuition and I could follow my own lead and work with each day as it came. So I didn't feel like I was completely in the dark, even though this was my first baby. I was just simply following what felt good for me, instinct. One thing that I talk a lot about on my courses is I talk about doshas and the Vata constitution. And I'm not going to teach you about it, but Vata babies are usually the ones that are problematic at the maternal health nurse. They are the babies that don't sleep. They are the babies that are in the lower 5th percentile because they're not putting on weight. They're not feeding that much. And all of a sudden, why I want to share this is that there's a lot of mums that all of a sudden feel like there's something wrong with my baby. I'm doing something wrong. It's not right. And you go into masculine fix-it mode, and it still doesn't work. And you spend years trying to help sleep train your baby, feed it more, even though it doesn't want to be fed, etc. And unless something is really wrong with your baby, and sometimes this is the process you go through to find out, is that if you think of adults and your friends and the different constitutions that you see around, is that we all eat differently. Some of us like to graze. Some of us like to eat massive meals, and we go, how do you eat that much? Aren't you hungry? Don't you want to eat more? How do you live off 3 hours of sleep? How do you sleep for 10 hours? Is that we are all different, and a baby knows its true nature from the day it's born, but we often manipulate this and condition this in our babies, toddlers, and children, and teenagers, and even adults as we grow up, as they grow up, as we grow with them. So the Vata children are usually those ones who parents will, and a lot of people have related to this in my course, they go, yep, that's totally what I did with my Vata child. And then I realized they were normal. Then I realized that they had this creative flair, that they were very spiritually connected. They just aren't cut out to eat 3 big meals a day, that they will just graze. Their tendency will be to not gain weight. So we can see this in babies and kids from a very, very young age. So I just didn't want people like measuring my baby and telling me that she was in a certain percentile. I knew that she was thriving. I knew she was feeding. She was going to the toilet. She was doing wheeze and poos, and she was happy. She was healthy. Now, I get how this can help you if you're just feeling a little bit lost. But again, this is my story that I'm sharing. So we had a number of calls from the maternal health nurse, and it was always advocating for ourselves. No, we're not interested. Okay, the next time it's like they need a little bit more information. Don't worry, we've done our research. Everything's really good with our child. We just don't feel like we need this, but we will contact you if we feel that we need your support. Because the whole thing is maternal health nurses are meant to help you once your midwife has stopped seeing you after 6 weeks or so. I think we saw our midwife a few times for about 3 weeks, and then I visited her at 5 weeks for a perineal tear that I had. But yeah, we had to have a number of calls, and finally I think the third or the fourth call was like, look, please just stop calling us. We're okay, we're sane, we're healthy. We just don't want to come to the maternal health nurse. Still seeing our midwife for the meantime. We've got a really good relationship with her. We'll contact her, and if she feels like we need to come, then we will come. We didn't do prenatal classes. I mean, we knew that we were going to move to New Zealand. We also didn't do postnatal like coffee groups or anything like that. Gav and I were quite happy with one another's company. We were quite happy just doing things on our own and attracting the right people into our lives as they came along. So yeah, there didn't feel like a need to have that level of connection. So again, just sharing this because some of you think I've got to do prenatal classes, I've got to do this, I've got to do that, I've got to join a mum's group and a coffee group and maternal health nurse and so on, is that, again, you decide what works for you. Don't do it because I did it, just do it because it feels good to you. Inform yourself, collect your information, then make your decision, because ultimately you have to take responsibility for your decisions and live with that. So I feel really happy about my decisions 8 years on. Moving on to the next thing, I did get a little perineal tear. So in my birth story, Violet shot out with one go, hand on her head. I just had this innate urge to push her out in one go. And one of my biggest fears actually before pregnancy was, what if I get a perineal tear? And so, of course, I was doing a lot of stuff and research around this to prevent it as much as possible. And I had this tiny, tiny tear, and my midwife checked it out. And what I really loved is that she didn't just like dive in there. I was like, I don't even want you to go near there. So she told me what to do so she could check. And she said, there's a little tear in there. I couldn't even face to look at it. And she said, I could put a stitch in it, but it would be okay. And I was like, I don't think I could even let you near me with a needle, let alone something to stitch me up. But it wasn't bad enough for her to have to do anything. Now, I never looked at it. It just was something that I couldn't face, but I trusted her. But then what I realized, like, this is one of my fears playing out. And then post-pregnancy, I was like, how do people sit cross-legged? I'm not doing that. I'm keeping everything together. It really played on my mind, and I realized how much it played on my mind. And I had to see her again at 5 weeks. And so this is just a bit of an analogy for how much we can grow something in our mind when it's not actually the truth, because I never looked at it to check on it. But I was holding so much tension in my glutes and in my pelvis because it was almost like I felt like I could hold the tear together. So, you know, legs were always closed. They were never like cross-legged or, yeah, it was just everything was held so tightly. And I remember Gav massaging my glutes probably about 5 to 7 days after the pregnancy. And I realized how much I realized how much I was holding on. I just burst into tears, and it was great. So just having that release. But at 5 weeks, I just said, this tear is playing on my mind. And I got caught up in like, give me all the herbs, give me all the things to help this heal. And when she checked me at 5 weeks, she said, it's fine. It's healed. I don't know what you're worried about. And reassured me that that area has just got such high blood flow. It turns over, it heals very quickly. And so I just needed that reassurance that everything was okay. And that was enough for me. And I think she was working with a Chinese herbalist. And so I did get some Chinese herbs just to help with this fear that was going on in my mind. And then that was that. It was done. So yeah, interesting, because probably by, some other people's tears and experiences that they've had, and I know they can get to grade 3, 4, which is quite significant, is that I don't think my midwife would have let me go without a stitch if it was more significant. And yeah, it wasn't too bad in the scheme of things, but it was my one fear about having a baby is a tear. Okay, skipping around a little bit, we did decide to co-sleep. We continued co-sleeping. Oh gosh, well, it feels like Violet only just got out of her bed. She's 8. But yeah, we decided to co-sleep. It was easy for feeding. Oh, she wakes up. Sometimes she would find the boob on her own and I could just go to sleep. Now, Gav doesn't drink. He doesn't do drugs, no alcohol. He's not like a really dead to the world sleeper. And so we did have her in the middle, but we took all of these things into consideration. Some people will hear bad stories and then just go flat out no to co-sleeping. But again, risk factors. She was, again, a pretty robust little baby that in the event that Gav was like touching her a little bit, she would make a noise, and I was alert enough to wake up. Now, I've worked with some clients who the mums do not wake for their babies and it's the husbands. I've only met a few of them, but they are dead to the world. So I was always awake enough to say, hey, Gav, you're just a little bit close. Sometimes I would just put her on my side as well. Sometimes I would have a wall next to the bed so she wouldn't roll off. And yeah, the co-sleeping was amazing. It was easy. It was convenient. We didn't need to buy a cot. We never bought a cot. When we moved into a 1-bedroom apartment, which was absolutely tiny, probably the size of our kitchen and lounge right now, is that she just slept in our bed with us. Or she was so small that we would just put a little sheepskin down on the ground and she would sometimes sleep on the floor. People say all sorts of things. Oh, you co-sleep with them, you won't get them out of your bed, or blah, blah, blah. Again, it's all individual. So yes, there were times where she was still in our bed or next to our bed when she was 3 or 4. At the age of 5, we were like, gosh, when you turn 5, you're going to be in your own bed. And she'd do it sometimes, not a lot. And then she'd just keep on waking us up. And sleep is one of my biggest priorities. Anything like sleep fixes everything for me. It gives me the best ideas. It helps my immune system. I want sleep. I don't want someone to interrupt me. I don't want my child to interrupt me. So when we started trying to push herself into her bed, her into her bed, she kept on waking us up. It was ridiculous. I was like, just freaking get in our bed so I can go to sleep. So yeah, my boundaries weren't strong, but I wanted sleep. What worked for me. And then Gav and I went away for a period of time for a few days and my parents looked after her. So we were over in Melbourne. We went off to do some retreat and my parents looked after her. And my dad said to me, she's not ready to go into her own bed. Just let her sleep in yours, because he was sleeping with her whilst we were away. And it's interesting. That's probably one of the very few times where I felt like I had permission to just put her back in our bed. And yeah, so she was back in our bed, and then every now and then she would stay in her own. We had feng shui done, all sorts of things, because her room's opposite the bad energy room. And anyway, now she stays in her bed, which is really great. But it took the time. We weren't fussed. We don't have any other kids. I was okay. I was more about let her do it when she feels ready. But yeah, you got to be willing to take the responsibility and deal with whatever comes. Another friend tried co-sleeping and her baby didn't like it. It liked to be in the room next to them. So each to their own. So that was my co-sleeping journey. I did take some herbs. I used to be a herbalist, and so I took some herbs for postpartum bleeding to help with the postpartum bleeding and making sure that it was only 6 weeks. And I also had other herbs, which I talked about at different stages of the birth or pregnancy. I had some milk flow herbs that I had made up for myself as well, in the case that my milk flow dropped at any time. And I noticed that it's really common for women at around the 6-week mark to feel like all of a sudden they're not making milk because they don't feel the pain and the engorgement in their breasts, but it's more that I feel the baby's adjusted to supply and demand, and that the milk flow comes when the baby wants to suckle. But yeah, there are women that I've worked with who have had milk flow issues. Stress is a big part. And then there are some amazing herbs that help too. So feeding, I did have an idea that I wanted to breastfeed for 2 years and that I would introduce solids around 6 months. I think we introduced it slightly earlier, again, tuning into our baby, and her signs that she was giving us is that she was ready for food earlier. We didn't want to introduce sweet foods like bananas or carrots or sweet potato or apple. We wanted to just introduce her to foods like avocado. She ate some other stuff, but we didn't go straight for the sweet foods. I think that sometimes people think, oh, you got to make it tasty. And it's like, well, it's actually just a new experience for them. It's texture, it's a different taste. And yeah, so, and wasn't big into making a huge effort into blending special baby foods or ice cubing them or anything like that. And a friend of mine, we had babies at similar times. She said at 9 months, oh, my kid's just eating the same food as we are. I was like, oh, okay, we'll just do that. That's so much easier. And so 9 months, Violet was just not eating anything special or anything particular for her. She was just eating foods that we were eating. So I'm really grateful for that friend sharing. But yeah, it wasn't this huge debacle to like make separate food for the baby. It's like, you don't have to have your avocado mashed in a blender. I can mash it with a fork. I'm sharing this because, again, why am I sharing it? To inspire you, but just to let you know, things don't need to be as hard as some people make it out to be. So the feeding, I chose to feed to 20 months. I was a little bit over breastfeeding at that point in time, in public, Violet trying to pull my top down, etc. And I was like, this is just time. And the weaning process was a little bit annoying. So I actually decided I wanted to go to Tasmania to work. So we had just moved back to New Zealand, but I decided to do a 3-week locum in Australia. And I think Gav stayed at home with her that whole 3 weeks, which was amazing. I love my alone time. I had no issue leaving her. I loved my osteo work at the time, and it was the best move to help with the weaning because when I got back, there wasn't a transition anymore. And she was fine. She had fun with Gav as well. So that was my breastfeeding journey. Yeah, my breastfeeding journey was pretty easy. I did get a couple of bouts of mastitis in the early days where I felt pain and I felt that fluey kind of symptom. And I have this herb mix that I used to sell, and it's just a mix of bark remedies and a herb, which I called Liquid Gold. And it was amazing because I didn't want to take antibiotics. With my history of taking so many antibiotics for my skin and messing up my hormones, I would do anything not to take it. And so it was poke root. I'll share that with you. I used to blend it with bark flowers. And just to note that you shouldn't go out and buy this on your own, nor can you easily get it. And there will be some herbalists and naturopaths who are dead against prescribing this in lactation. It's a very different dose to what you would normally do for a therapeutic dose of how poke root is traditionally used. But there are some old studies around one study out there about midwives using this in Canada, I believe. And I can tell you that I probably used it on I used this on many women, and it was able to clear their mastitis within 24 to 48 hours. So actually, when I worked with pregnant women in the clinic, I'd say, buy this bottle of Liquid Gold. It'll last you for 6 to 9 months. It barely costs anything. And if you need it, you've got it there. Because who out there, we're still very reactive, is we think it's going to get better. And then, mastitis can take hold really quickly within hours. and then all of a sudden you've got it, and then you're in pain, and then you're going for the antibiotics, etc. So this stuff was just so powerful. And I tell you, the only times that I got the signs of mastitis was when I stopped taking it. Anyway, again, I'm not going to go into details around this. It's very individual how this is prescribed. Yeah, otherwise I could do a whole podcast on it, which I'm not going to. But yeah, that stuff saved me a good handful of times, especially when that whole supply and demand was coming in that first 6 weeks to 6 months and breastfeeding settling in. Usually if you don't have mastitis within the first 6 weeks to 6 months, you're usually going to be okay. But it's not pleasant. And so many people push through the pain because there is this responsibility of looking after a child. It's like having the flu and trying to do everything as normal, plus look after a child. Okay, so that was my feeding journey, food, baby wearing. I talked a little bit about mastitis. Yep, the pram, hard rubbish. Violet was very mobile from the age of 6 months. And she would just crawl out of the pram. She wouldn't like to be strapped in. If she was in it, she couldn't be strapped in. So maybe it was that we didn't introduce it to her soon enough, but isn't it great? Didn't have to spend thousands of dollars on one of those prams that take up a lot of room. Again, yes, we have one child. I'm very aware of that. And yeah, you don't need as much stuff. So that was our pram journey. Cloth nappies was great. Elimination communication. I think this is the last thing that I want to talk about, and I find it really fascinating, and I'd love to introduce you to this. You know, there's this whole thing, again, you hear boys are harder to toilet train than girls, but my sister had a boy, which he is 6 months younger than Violet, and she also did elimination communication very successfully from a very young age. So I'll explain what it is in a minute, but from 6 weeks, we had Violet peeing on the potty, and it did take a lot of attention. So if you don't have this full attention that you can give to your baby, it is very difficult to do elimination communication. I think by 6 months, she really didn't need a nappy, but we kind of kept them on just in case. It was like our little security blanket, but most of the time it would be dry for us. So elimination communication, you can Google it, and honestly, I think all of the information is there, but I'll give it to you in a nutshell, is really just being present with your baby, their signs, their sounds, what's happening before they need to go to the toilet. Now, most of us live in this reactive world, is that we only react when there's pain, and we forget all the things that happen beforehand. When I'm working with people with emotions, I'm always saying, well, when this injury happened, when this ailment overcame your body, this illness set in, what was life like for the few weeks or the few months or even the few years prior to that? Because it's not a lot of the time do we instantly get something. We like to say that, but it's built up over time, and then it's the straw that breaks the camel's back. So it required me to be very present. And first I did have a piece of paper where I document the times that I fed her, and so breastfed her. Often I would only catch the wee afterwards or the poo afterwards, and then I would start to see the pattern. But rather than relying on my brain to remember, I would document it down. So it just gave a lot of attention and intention to this, because the task was, once the pee or the poo happens, notice what were their signs beforehand. It's like, oh, was I actually paying attention? So I would often miss the signs. But then, of course, I really wanted to give this a go, is that I started to pick up on her signs just before she was going to the toilet. So I often say, as adults, we are communicating with the most subtle body language and with our energy. But a lot of us aren't in tune with that because we're so distracted, we're so consumed by pain, we're so consumed with a whole bunch of stuff. So it was really amazing to do this, because I don't believe a human baby wants to be in a diaper, in its nappy, in wee, in poo. And I used to have this conversation with a friend who was an incontinence nurse around this who sort of theorized or said, I think a lot of the issues can be because it's like you stay in a nappy and you just wee in your nappy, you just poo in your nappy and you stay in it. But my philosophy was as soon as you do it, you're getting out of that nappy and you're getting a clean one put on, which was the great thing about cloth nappies. I didn't feel like there was all this expense going to disposable nappies. So yeah, I started to hear her signs in her voice, her movements. And it was great because it's like, well, this baby is communicating with me. She doesn't have the verbal dialogue and the words to speak to me, but she is communicating with me. Now, a friend told me that apparently babies do have their own language. I didn't look any further into it. But yeah, we just don't understand it. And I remember years and years ago watching a lady who said, oh, this is the tired cry, this is the hungry cry, and how they had a certain sound or like vowel sounds to them. Anyway, I haven't followed that lady for a long time. I think I saw her on Oprah. But yeah, there were signs, and it just felt really good to be able to communicate with my baby and not have her sitting in a soiled nappy all the time. So there was documentation. When did I feed her? When is she going? What's her patterning? And often when I would feed her, I would just keep like this waterproof disposable mat under me. I'd keep a cloth nappy under, but I'd open it up. And quite often it was instantly after she had finished feeding that she would go. So then I learned, all right, as soon as you finish feeding, I'm going to stick you on the potty. There were a few other keys that key moments when we would put her on the potty, and give her the opportunity is the key. Give her the opportunity to go to the toilet. So before we would get in the car and she'd be in a car seat, we would say, we're getting in the car. Do you want to go to the toilet? And we'd take her nappy off, sit her on the potty, give her an opportunity. If she didn't go after a few minutes, then we would stick her in the car. As soon as she came out of the car seat, we would say, okay, put her on the potty, and we would have cues like wee wee, pss, pss. Poos was poo poo, and grunt like so again, getting her to associate this, and it's the repetition and getting her to recognize that this is my opportunity to go. Now, I know some people are against this, that we should go when we want to go. And look, we still had accidents at night when she was older as well. But the other times where before we'd go for a walk, and we were sort of in a routine, is that I think it was around 9 a.m. we would go for a walk, and I'd wave the baby wrap in front of her and I'd say, walkies, show it to her, make sure she's looking, and then I'd stick her on the potty and give her an opportunity to go. As soon as we came back from a walk, she often had a dry nappy, we'd stick her on the potty and she would go to the toilet. So in and out of car seats, in and out of baby wraps, and noticing her other patterns and signs. And I got really in tune with that. And it was like, oh my gosh, we like caught all of her pees today. And then it was on to poos. And it was just so satisfying. From 6 weeks is when it started. And sometimes I would change her nappy and I would go pee, and she would pee in an open nappy, which then made me realize I really need to like take the potty with us. And people were like, oh my gosh, that's fascinating. And I was like, yes, you can communicate with your baby. You can learn the signs. You can teach them things from such a young age. What was interesting is that, so I hear some people go, I don't know why they're crying. And sometimes I think it's a soiled nappy that they're just keeping on because they've only done 2 Ps when it should be able to hold 8 Ps. I don't know why they're crying. And I'd often talk about elimination communication, because there were times when Violet was like, she did not want to be in her car seat. Apart from stop-start traffic in Melbourne, there were times where she did not want to be in that car seat. Take her out, she'd go to the toilet, and then she'd sit back in there happily. So it was almost like she's like, I don't want to sit in my own shit when I'm on this car ride. Get me out of here. So I'd love you to pay attention to that if this is maybe your child who's super uncomfortable as well. Sometimes I tell mums this and they're like, whatever, I don't have energy for this. But yeah, I mean, you've got to give it a go and you do have to have some dedication to this. My sister, so to prove you wrong that boys do not take longer than girls, is that my nephew is 6 months younger than Violet. And she started the elimination communication, and she was getting him to go on the potty from a really young age. I don't think he's ever wet the bed at all. And then he was having some difficulty sleeping, and she said that she'd get him to sit on the toilet, he'd go pee, and then he'd go straight back to sleep. So I think that this is one thing that's maybe missing around the whole, are they getting love and cuddles? Are they getting fed? Are they getting their nappy changed? Why don't we add in there that maybe they need to go to the toilet and they're trying to tell us, but we're sitting there going, just shush, just go in your nappy. Like, this is how we operate and just think it's normal. I remember when I was younger at high school watching a documentary about China and babies and seeing this lady like hold her baby over a bucket and cueing it to pee. And now it's come full circle and I'm that mum. So elimination communication, whenever I missed it, it wasn't like beat myself up, but it was recognizing, because I did start studying herbal medicine during my pregnancy, and then all of a sudden I was on a mission to get it finished because the requirements changed. So I noticed that when I was studying, when my attention was elsewhere, that's when I would miss my Violet's cues to want to go to the toilet. So it does take presence, but there are also other times, you know, if you didn't have time to really tune into the rhythms of your baby, you could just do the thing before you get in the pram, before you, after they get out of the pram, in the car, out of the car, in the baby wrap, out of the baby wrap. Can you give them these opportunities to go to the toilet? And then they will get used to that. But you've got to be consistent. This is where I say, like, training animals is very much like working with humans. You've got to be consistent. You've always got to give those opportunities. So I wouldn't do it unless you can stay consistent, but I'd love for you to explore elimination communication. It felt really nice to not have Violet in a soiled nappy a lot of the time. Oh, is that where I'm wrapping up? This is the difference of me going through a list of notes that are out of order and just speaking off the cuff. This is my postpartum journey. Violet is now 8. I look back now and it's funny because I've had some astrology readings and Chinese horoscopes saying, you and Violet are going to have some challenges. Not that I try and manifest the challenges. We certainly do have some challenges in our relationship, but I'm more accepting of them. I know they're going to pass. The way I would love to bring Violet up, and why I got an astrology reading for her as well, is to know what is her life path, not the path that I think that she should live, not that I think she should have an online business and so on, is really to nurture her path so she stays connected with her true nature. Of course, we make mistakes. We are not ideal parents 100% of the time. She gets amazing experiences with Gav. I'd have to say that she probably has a stronger bond with Gav at the moment than she does with me. This has been in the last few years. Gav and her have traveled on their own overseas ever since she was maybe 3 or so, and I trust him to do that. As long as she comes back alive, I'm happy. I don't pack their bags. If he forgets the undies, he forgets the undies. He can deal with it. He'll learn for next time. Gav learns from mistakes. So yeah, they go on some pretty incredible adventures, particularly out in nature. That's Gav's jam. And I have cool city trips with her. I do go out into nature with her as well, introducing her to horses. Don't know if she's that keen. But yeah, I want to nurture her pathway, help her stay connected so that she doesn't become like a lot of the people I work with who are amazing people, but feeling so disconnected from who they are, not knowing what their truth is, not knowing the life that they're here to live. I want her to know this and follow it, even though it might get uncomfortable for me at times. So I do look back. I don't ever feel like, geez, time's gone fast and I've missed it. She's 8, super cool. I have had thoughts recently of like, wow, you were so incredibly easy from the age of 0 to 6, like easy. Baby slept. She's a great sleeper, sleeps in, sleeps when she's sick. Yeah, she was super easy, and now she's challenging me a lot. So I've got to be really firm with my boundaries. I've got to be clear with my communication. There are consequences. She's very aware when the consequence comes. It doesn't just come out of nowhere. And yeah, that is the challenge of the postpartum journey at the moment. Who knows when I will do the next podcast. But yeah, part 1, 2, 3, 4, all out now. Preconception, pregnancy, birth, and the postpartum period. And yeah, happy to finally share this in a podcast. I used to do workshops and talks with other practitioners and women, and I love sharing this story. For years, I've been saying I've got to share this. So it's good to get it out there. If this helps you, please get in touch. I love to hear how this lands for you. If there is someone out there that you know is searching for information, which is why I'm really putting this out there, because I searched high and low during my preconception and pregnancy journey for inspiration, then please feel free to pass this on to friends, family members, parents, where you might need to communicate things to. Birth, pregnancy, it is your journey. It's not for anyone else, you know, apart from perhaps your immediate family. Immediate family is not your parents, it's your partner, it's your children. Is make decisions that feel good for you, even if it doesn't make other people happy. Inform yourself, listen to other people's stories, collect information, make decisions that feel good for you. You're going to have to take responsibility for it. All of this is not shared to give you advice, it's shared to give you inspiration. Don't do things just because I've done it. Do it because you want to. That's what it always comes back to. So thank you for letting me share my 4-part Violet story. That's what it is. And I look forward to hearing from you and sharing with you again soon.